Bonjour tout le monde. Alors, si vous voulez bien prendre vos places, on va commencer. C'est tôt, mais l'heure se fait tard, comme on dit. Bonjour, je suis Antonia Maioni. Je suis la présidente sortante de la Fédération des sciences humaines et je suis ravie de vous voir ici ce matin en si grand nombre. I'm honored to welcome you here this morning to our breakfast lockup, which is actually a lot more fun than the budget lockup for those of you who've been in the budget lockup, and of course the food is much better as well. So welcome on Budget Day to our great Breakfast on the Hill event. Avant de commencer, par exemple, même si c'est une très belle journée budgétaire ici à Ottawa et le soleil est parmi nous, je voulais juste qu'on se donne quelques secondes pour se rappeler des événements tragiques en Europe, à Turquie il y a quelques jours et évidemment à Bruxelles aujourd'hui. Et c'est sûr que nos pensées sont avec nos collègues, nos voisins, nos citoyens, les citoyens de ces deux pays-là. The Federation, as most of you know, is the national voice for Canada's scholars, students, and practitioners in the humanities and social sciences. Our membership comprises over 160 universities, colleges, and scholarly associations right across Canada. The Federation's event today is part of its Big Thinking on the Hill series. It's a lecture series that brings research from the social sciences and the humanities closer to many of you, parliamentarians who are here today, as well as other decision makers in Ottawa who can use it to inform policies that affect directly the lives of Canadians. Et je souhaite remercier Greg Fergus, notre partenaire et notre député parrain, on aime dire, de la série. Thank you very much, Greg Fergus, for being our partner as MP in this series. C'est grâce à M. Fergus que ces événements peuvent se tenir dans ce magnifique restaurant du Parlement. And of course, we'd also like to thank our partner, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, for their continued support of our series, and I'd like to thank the President, Ted Hewitt, who's with us today as well. We are pleased to provide call-in simultaneous translation. So this is not as difficult as it sounds. The dial-in instructions are on your tables. And for those of you who don't have earbuds, we can get you some from the registration desk. I would encourage you to kind of figure out how that works because the Q&A today will be in both languages. Ce matin, en fait, nous allons parler de l'un des grands piliers de notre démocratie, notre système électoral. Et en tant que démocratie, au Canada, notre système gouvernemental tout entier tire sa légitimité du simple acte du vote. Et il y a certaines personnes dans l'audience aujourd'hui qui sont là grâce à cet simple exercice de légitimité. Et je parle de tous les membres du Parlement et je les accueille chaleureusement ce matin. We have just come out of an election season, and many of you in this room are here because of that campaign and because of that vote. But not all seems to be well in Canada. There are a significant group of Canadians who argue that our current voting system is, for lack of a better word, broken, that we should replace it with a different kind of system. And we now know that the federal government has committed to changing the way we elect future governments. There is, in short, an appetite for change, both among Canadians and among government officials, that may be unprecedented in Canada's modern history. Mais changer un élément si fondamental de notre démocratie n'est pas chose facile et naturellement, nous souhaitons rester prudents afin d'envisager toutes les alternatives possibles avant d'opérer des changements majeurs. Nous sommes rassemblés donc aujourd'hui pour parler d'un des modes de scrutin alternatifs, la représentation proportionnelle. Comme la plupart d'entre vous le savent déjà, les avantages et inconvénients associés à ce mode de scrutin sont le sujet de débats animés à travers le pays, mais en fait à travers tous les pays. We're privileged to be joined this morning by someone who can really help shed an important light on what is proportional representation as an alternative in terms of electoral reform, and that is Dr. André Blais. Dr. Blais is a leading expert in democratic systems. He's a full professor and colleague in political science at the University of Montreal, a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the Centre for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. Bienvenue, Dr. Blais. Dr. Blais' research focuses on elections, electoral systems, voter turnout, and public opinion. He has been the past president of the Canadian Political Science Association, well known for training a generation of students in electoral systems, including some very influential members of the government today and in Parliament. I'm honored to lead a conversation with him this morning to help explore these issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. André Blais. Alors, le format aujourd'hui, c'est que moi, je vais commencer les questions avec le professeur Blais et ensuite, vous allez avoir la parole. C'est sûr qu'on ne va pas traverser toutes les questions qu'on peut avoir dans la salle, mais on va commencer, on va mettre la balle en motion. On va commencer avec la réforme du mode de scrutin qui fait partie du débat actuel politique au Canada. On a vu récemment, M. Blais, que pendant la campagne électorale, on avait beaucoup de voix qui se sont levées, pas contre la démocratie canadienne, mais qui étaient un peu inquiets avec l'état de la démocratie à cause du système électoral. Comment décrivez-vous l'état actuel du débat autour de la réforme électorale?
Moi, je dirais que le débat n'est pas vraiment entamé. Il y a des partis politiques qui ont pris position pour un changement du mode de scrutin ou pour le maintien du mode de scrutin. Il y a le parti qui a gagné, le Parti libéral, qui a promis de changer le mode de scrutin. Il y a eu un débat à savoir si toute proposition devrait aller en référendum ou non. Mais le débat sur les avantages et les désavantages des différents modes de scrutin, à mon avis, n'est pas vraiment entamé. Je suppose qu'il va commencer dès lors que la commission parlementaire sera formée. Et j'ai bien hâte de voir comment cela va se passer.
D'où vient cette soif de changement?
Je crois que les citoyens ne sont jamais tout à fait satisfaits de la façon dont la démocratie fonctionne. Et donc, il ne faut pas s'imaginer que c'est particulier au Canada, que dans beaucoup de pays, c'est pas simple de voir comment on devrait voter. Il y a énormément de façons de le faire. Et je crois que c'est sain que les gens soient un peu insatisfaits parce que ça nous invite à réfléchir à comment ça devrait être, à essayer d'imaginer de meilleures façons de procéder. Donc, le fait qu'il y ait de l'insatisfaction, pour moi, c'est un bon signe, en fait, que les gens réfléchissent et aimeraient avoir une démocratie qui fonctionne mieux.
Donc, contester, ça fait la santé de la démocratie.
Contester assez. Assez. Pas trop, peut-être, à certains moments. Mais oui, contester au moins à l'occasion, je pense que c'est très sain. Oui.
C'est bien. So, while we've been having this debate about electoral reform, today what we want to talk about is proportional representation, which is something that you've studied in depth. But help us understand the concept. What does it mean? Where is it practiced? How is it practiced?
The basic idea is very simple and straightforward. Proportional representation means that the number of seats that the party gets is proportional to its vote. So the idea is that if you have, let's say, 10 seats and you have 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats, one seat. So the basic idea is very simple. What we have to understand that this implies multi-member districts. You have to have, if only one seat, you cannot proportionally allocate to that seat. There's one seat. So it implies that you have, let's say, 10 seats, and every party gets the number of seats proportional to its vote share. So that's the basic idea. In practice, though, things don't work that easily. The countries that use proportional representation, at the same time, have to decide district magnitude. So there are countries like Netherlands where there is one district for the whole country. And that's pure proportional representation. But most of the countries use some districts, and the typical district size is about 10 seats. And then 10 seats, this means that a party that gets, let's say, only 3 or 4% of the votes probably will not get one seat at all. So it's proportional representation for the parties that reach a certain threshold. But in other countries like Chile, it's proportional representation with 2 seats. So it's only the 2 parties with the most votes that get any seat. So you can have 10% of the votes and get no seat at all. So it depends a lot about district magnitude. And on top of that, there is also thresholds. So in some countries like Germany, you have to have at least 5% of the vote to get any seat. In Turkey, it's 10%. So this is still called proportional representation, but it's kind of a sort of odd type of proportional representation because you need a lot of votes to get into parliament. So there are all kinds of varieties of proportional representation, but the basic idea is that you have to have multi-member districts with many seats, and the basic idea is that your number of seats that you get is proportional to your votes.
But it seems to me that most countries that you've mentioned and others as well have some form or part proportional representation. So a country like Canada that is still very strictly a single-member first-past-the-post system is actually a rarity in the democratic world.
It is a rarity. It's basically, the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, which is not quite first-past-the-post, but single-member district. So it's really former British colonies that have kept the existing first-past-the-post or single-member districts. The great majority of countries in the world of democracies use some kind of PR. All the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Germany, Spain, Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, the great majority of countries use some kind of proportional representation. So our system is rare.
So let's talk about why countries would adopt proportional representation. What is it about proportional representation that is so appealing?
I think the most basic, appeal of PR is that it is perceived to be fair. Mm-hmm. The very idea that, the proportion of seats that you get depends on the proportion of votes sort of makes a lot of sense. So intuitively, it appears to be a fair system compared to our system. So I think that's the basic, advantage that people perceive in proportional representation. Things get a bit more complicated when you get into details and exactly how it works, but that's the basic appeal.
Mais est-ce que c'est vrai? Est-ce qu'il y a des preuves selon lesquelles la représentation proportionnelle favorise une participation élevée, favorise un peu la façon de vraiment traduire la volonté des citoyens dans une démocratie?
On va regarder ces différentes questions-là une après l'autre. On va commencer par le taux de participation, qui est peut-être le premier critère qu'on peut voir dans quelle mesure on espère que le taux de participation est plus élevé. Je pense que la démocratie fonctionne bien lorsque le taux de participation est plus élevé. Donc, c'est un indicateur très intéressant du fonctionnement de la démocratie. Et donc, on peut se demander, est-ce qu'en fait, le taux de participation est plus élevé dans les pays qui utilisent la proportionnelle? Alors, ce qu'on fait en ce moment-là, c'est qu'on examine toutes les élections possibles à travers le monde dans les démocraties. Moi, j'ai fait une étude où on avait 324 élections dans 91 pays. Et on compare le taux de participation dans les pays qui ont le proportionnel, d'autres qui n'ont pas la proportionnelle. On compare aussi le degré de proportionnalité du système. On tient compte de d'autres facteurs, parce qu'il y a d'autres facteurs qui jouent. C'est pas seulement le mode de scrutin, le niveau de richesse du pays, l'âge de voter, le pouvoir de la Chambre, etc. Donc, une série d'autres facteurs. Et quand on fait ça dans une étude que j'avais faite à l'époque avec une autre auteure, Agnieszka Dobrzyńska, on regarde donc toutes ces élections-là, on contrôle tous les autres facteurs, et notre estimé, à ce moment-là, de l'effet de la proportionnelle, et ça augmente de 3 points de pourcentage. Ça, c'était notre estimé, et ça, c'est assez typique. Toutes les études que j'ai vues suggèrent un effet positif. Aucune ne suggère un effet négatif. Les premières études suggèrent un effet beaucoup plus important, parce que si on regarde seulement l'Europe, l'effet est plus important. Lorsqu'on regarde plus grand nombre de pays, l'effet est beaucoup plus petit, mais il semble y avoir un petit effet, mais on ne comprend pas toujours pourquoi. Parce que, normalement, on devrait penser que la proportionnelle aide parce qu'il y a plus de partis. Les gens ont plus de choix. Et quand on regarde l'effet du nombre de partis, on a un résultat paradoxal, c'est qu'en général, plus il y a de partis, plus le taux de participation est faible. Et donc, c'est comme si les gens trouvaient qu'il y a trop de choix ou que le résultat n'est pas assez décisif, il y a des coalitions après. Et donc, on note que le proportionnel semble favoriser un tout petit peu le mode de scrutin, mais on ne comprend pas tout à fait pourquoi. Et donc, moi, ma position pour le moment, c'est une position de sceptique. Okay. Si j'avais à dire une position ou une autre, je dirais probablement que le proportionnel ne favorise pas un taux de participation plus élevé. Mais je suis peut-être un peu trop sceptique en général, peut-être un petit effet positif.
Okay, so small positive effect on voter turnout. That's yes. As far as you'll go with
possibly
small. So yes. It's a lot of change for a possible small effect on voter turnout.
Yes.
What about satisfaction?
Satisfaction with democracy. This is a bit easier in some sense, but perhaps more difficult in other sense. So we then, in that case, we look at surveys. And we look at surveys done across the world. There was CSCS, Comparative Study of Electoral System. It's basically, in this case, looking at about 20 countries in the world and looking at how satisfied people are with the electoral system, and we link it to the degree of proportionality. And there is a question, which is the basic question is asked, how satisfied are you with how democracy works in your country? Very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, not very satisfied, not satisfied at all. And we again control for other factors. And the result is now, in this case, very clear. No difference.
No difference.
Satisfaction is not higher under PR. There are other questions in these surveys as well, though, which indicate some differences. And the questions about, for instance, how fairly or unfairly the election was conducted. So we ask about the percentage of fairness of the conduct of elections. And in that case, there is a clear and substantial difference, that people are more likely to believe that elections are fair under PR. So there is a real, clearly positive impact there. But not on satisfaction, which is, I think, the basic overall judgment. And there was also some slight, small, positive impact on perceptions of responsiveness. We ask about, how do you think parties care about what ordinary citizens think? And on that sort of responsiveness, perceived responsiveness of the system. And there, PR countries appear to perform slightly better. So on the question of evaluations of performance, on fairness, yes, clearly positive. On responsiveness, not so, perhaps a small impact. On overall satisfaction, which is, I think, the usual sort of overall final judgment call, no difference. And no difference, one of the reasons here is that what we find is that PR would do better, generally speaking, if there were no coalition government. We see that when there is a coalition government, people are a bit less satisfied. So if you have a combination of PR and no coalition, then people will be more satisfied. So that's one of the drawback, if you like, of PR. It leads often, usually, to coalition governments, and coalition governments tend to produce somewhat less satisfaction.
So that's an important point, that if you change one part of your institutional makeup in a democracy, you're also going to be affecting another. And that might also have its own independent effects on voter satisfaction, but also on this idea of responsiveness to the democratic
Absolutely.
Institutions.
Yeah.
I want to end my part of this session with a question, which is a little, maybe I'm going to be pushing you a little bit, Professor Blais, but it's okay, let's try. We're here today, and you see the big turnout, because many people are interested in this issue. And the debate about trying to think about ways of moving forward in electoral reform will probably intensify. So where do we go from here?
My understanding is that there will be a parliamentary commission, that the parliamentary commission will have hearings, that we'll hear about the general public, about experts, hopefully about empirical evidence, and that the parties will think about the public good and not think about their own interest, and we'll come to a consensus.
And we'll have more research, right? So the president of SSHRC is here, we'll have more research on this. Oui, mais là, je vais pousser avec la question qui tue. Ah, vous savez, ceux qui écoutent, tout le monde en parle, the killer question. Okay?
I don't watch that program.
Should we do it? Devrait-on aller vers un système de représentation proportionnelle? Should we move towards a system of proportional representation in Canada?
La réponse ici est la suivante. J'ai identifié une quinzaine de conséquences possibles des modes de scrutin. Là, on a parlé de 2, puis en fait une troisième qui serait la correspondance. Donc, moi, j'ai une quinzaine de conséquences possibles par exemple, de la proportionnelle. Et je pense qu'en regardant les études, on peut en arriver à des conclusions assez claires, pas toujours, mais assez claires à la plupart des questions. Et là, après cela, on doit tout simplement, et là, je pense que c'est aux représentants politiques, décider quels sont les critères les plus importants. Par exemple, est-ce que le taux de participation, c'est important ou non? Est-ce que la satisfaction générale? Est-ce que la question de accountability, est-ce que c'est important? Il y a toute une série de dimensions. Et comme chercheur, je crois qu'on peut démontrer quels sont les effets probables des modes de scrutin. Et parmi tous ces effets-là, c'est un jugement à la fin normatif qui relève du public et, selon moi, des politiciens de déterminer, parmi toutes ces conséquences-là, lesquelles sont les plus importantes et lesquelles sont les moins importantes. Je n'indiquerai pas quel est mon avis personnel pour le moment, parce que, entre autres, à l'automne, je vais faire un exercice dans une classe à l'Université de Montréal où il y aura une assemblée délibérante et les étudiants, on va examiner tous les modes de scrutin, leurs effets, etc. Et dans les dernières semaines, il y aura une délibération, discussion avec les étudiants de la classe et les étudiants seront appelés à déterminer quel est le meilleur mode de scrutin pour le Canada. Et je m'engage à appuyer leurs propositions et donc je ne prendrai pas de position pour le moment.
Mais vous allez les transmettre, les résultats.
J'espère être invité, en fait, à venir présenter ces résultats à la commission parlementaire, peut-être à ce moment-là.
Parfait. Oui, on va attendre ça. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Blais. Thank you very much for your compelling thoughts, your answers to my questions. But I know that there are a lot more out in the room. So we'd like to invite you to take the microphones. Oh, one microphone. I don't know if there's two. There's one, at least I see. Since we're in the parliamentary restaurant, we're going to impose House of Commons rules, which is 30 seconds, I believe. So maybe some of the MPs can remind me. So make your questions short and to the point to Dr. Blais. And please identify yourself. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Bonjour, Dr. Blais. Mon nom est John Minot. J'ai une question plutôt quantitative, puis si vous permettez, une petite deuxième question. Quantitative, d'après vos études, je me demande si il y a eu des études qui demandent, oui ou non, qu'il y a généralement des augmentations de nombre de partis dans les systèmes qui passent à un système proportionnel. La deuxième partie, ce sera peut-être plus difficile à évaluer. Je me demande si l'évolution des politiques dans un gouvernement à travers des années est plus ou moins abrupte ou des gros changements avec un système comme le nôtre qu'avec un système proportionnel.
Merci.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Évidemment, la première question est plus facile que la seconde. Ça dépend beaucoup du type de régime proportionnel. On a des régimes très proportionnels, des autres seulement à moitié proportionnels, mais c'est absolument clair que le nombre de partis augmente. Ça, il n'y a absolument aucun doute. Le cas le plus récent est celui de la Nouvelle-Zélande et le nombre de partis a augmenté de façon substantielle. Donc, on peut s'attendre et ça, c'est l'effet le plus direct et le plus clair, que le nombre de partis augmente et que la probabilité de gouvernement minoritaire ou de coalition augmente en conséquence. Ça, c'est tout à fait clair. Pour ce qui est de l'impact sur les politiques publiques, c'est une des questions que j'ai dans mon cours et pour lequel j'ai pas revu toutes les études récemment. Donc, là, je réponds de façon un petit peu plus claire. Ce qui arrive, c'est que dans une proportionnelle, il risque de plus d'avoir des gouvernements de coalition et il peut y avoir des pouvoirs de veto des différents partis. Et donc, on s'attend en général à ce qu'il y ait moins de changements dans les scrutins proportionnels que dans les scrutins comme le nôtre présentement. Est-ce que les données confirment ça tout à fait? Je n'en suis pas tout à fait certain. En tout cas, c'est ce qu'on s'attend au plan théorique en général, à ce que les changements soient moins abrupts d'un gouvernement à l'autre dans un scrutin proportionnel. Mais je ne suis pas tout à fait sûr que les études le démontrent de façon tout à fait claire. Mais c'est ce à quoi on devrait s'attendre. Oui.
Prochaine question. Next question.
Thank you. Sheila Malcolmson, Member of Parliament for Nanaimo Ladysmith on Vancouver Island. Being involved in the British Columbia referendums, when we talked about charts and tables and how this would work, it turned people off. And through the election campaign, when we talked about outcomes of a proportional representation system, people seemed to engage more. So my traveling in Norway and other places where it appears that proportional representation governments are making decisions around investments in community and getting along and finding consensus and the common good. I'm now curious of the outcomes of proportional representation. Governments seem to elect more women, get more diversity in the outcome of representation, more voter participation. But my curiosity now is, do the governments put the policies and conditions in place that then foster more engagement from women and from minorities? So the policies are in place that create the conditions for more broad participation and therefore getting onto the ballot and therefore getting elected? Or are those people being elected directly by virtue of the democratic process? Thank you.
That's a very sort of important, difficult question. I just want to say that I don't think it increases turnout. So that's one thing. I think it might have a tiny impact, but my view here is not on women representation is pretty clear. But it's pretty clear. It's because of multi-member districts. It's much easier to construct lists which are basically gender equal, for instance. In terms of minority representation, it's not as clear that PR has that impact. Now, the most difficult question is what kind of impact it has on the policy climate, I guess, sort of a kind of how the parties relate to each other. And there is a very benign view of PR according to which, parties suddenly are angels and come to good compromises all the time.
Kumbaya.
I don't buy that. I assume that politics is a zero-sum game, that parties have the interest that the other parties be as weak as possible to get as many seats and so on. But the fact is that in those countries, they have to make deals. So they have to make compromises, and they understand each other probably better. But the other partners are also enemies. They're partners and enemies. And so it's a very sort of interesting game, which is a bit different than the one we have. But it is still a game in which the other parties are enemies. So it changes some things, but not everything, I would say.
Beware the frenemies, in other words. That's the... Okay, another short question, please.
My name is Ruel Amder, and I write for the Canadian Charger. A couple of points. First of all, the question about making deals. The other side of this is that it's more difficult to hold governments accountable. And then in terms of the consequences of PR or changes in the voting system, preferential voting, I think, would favor the Liberals. PR would help the minority parties, and the losers in any of these changes would be the Tories, I think. I'm not sure what the results would be for the bloc.
Okay, André, first question.
The first question is about accountability. That's interesting to me. I think the argument is that you have coalition governments, and then the government might not be quite as accountable because there are two or three parties, and which one do you feel guilty of the source of the problems and so on. I think it's not that complicated, that most of the time it's the leading party that is perceived to be responsible. So if things are going well, the leading party, basically is rewarded. If it's the opposite people are dissatisfied, they will vote against that leading party. So accountability is a bit more diffused under coalition government, but I don't think it's that huge of a problem, I would argue. As for who would benefit and lose from a system, clearly, if you're a small party, you'll do better under PR. If you're a big party, you'll do somewhat less. To the extent that the Liberals are a centrist party, they would probably benefit from alternative vote or preferential voting. That's also a fact. At the same time, many of the effects of the partisan effects of electoral systems are somewhat perverse sometimes. And there have been many changes in history where a party adopted a system to what it perceived to be its own benefit, and in fact it turned against that party. So I think I would sort of advise parties to be very, very careful in their analysis of what the consequences would be. Some of these consequences are completely unintended.
Let me paraphrase. Be careful what you wish for. 2 more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I'm Senator Green-Rain from British Columbia. I've been in the Senate now for 7 years and have experienced the turmoil of the last few years. And that, I think, is an unintended consequence of the fact that when we repatriated the Canadian Constitution, we put in an amending formula that perhaps was not thought out properly, so it makes it almost impossible to amend the Senate and do what a lot of people want to do. Having said that, my query is, I wonder in your studies if you have looked at countries that are similar to Canada, that is, that have a colonial background, but are also very, very large with an Indigenous population and with many new Canadians coming here. So our country is very, very large and very difficult to govern. We have a lot of levels of government right now, and the total costs of our governments to the taxpayer is very high. So I'm wondering if you've looked at how efficient a new system, a proportional representative system, could be for a country as big as Canada.
I'd preface my response in a somewhat unfair way. Every citizen of every country is convinced that our country is extremely special. There's nothing that's really, it's unique about this country. So as Canadians, I think we believe that we're, unique. And we share this belief with everyone on the planet. So we should just preface that as well. But you're right that there are specificities about Canada that makes it very difficult to make comparisons. And I guess the only country that's sort of close to Canada, I guess from that perspective, the closest I think would be Australia. And Australia has another system which is preferential voting, which is not PR. So from that perspective, we don't have a sort of a clear comparison. That being said, I can absolutely guarantee you that if we move to PR, there will be more parties. And I can guarantee that there will be minority and coalition governments. And that happens everywhere. And that I can guarantee.
Our last question from our MP.
Good morning, Wayne Stetsky. I'm the Member of Parliament for Kootenay, Columbia, which is in the Rocky Mountain area. You're all invited. Come for a visit.
Okay.
Proportional representation is very important to the constituents in my riding. I've already presented 2 petitions in Parliament on behalf of my constituents. British Columbia had a vote a number of years ago on proportional representation, but it was so complicated that people would not vote for it because people will not vote for change they don't understand. So I wonder if you could tell us the simplest system that you've come across that you think works.
So, André, your colleague Ken Carty was involved. Many of your political science colleagues were involved in that BC experiment. How do you answer?
Well, first, it wasn't that complicated. I can guarantee you that I can explain it in 5 minutes, and I'm sure that you will fully understand all of it. So I don't think it was that complicated once well explained. And it was a problem that there was really a campaign trying to inform people about what it meant and so on. So that's the first part of the answer. If you're looking for some kind of simple PR that seems to work, and, where people are happy is Scandinavia, right? It's Denmark, Finland, and so on. So I would go for Finland. And Finland has a PR system, very simple. You vote for a party. And the district side is, I think, on average about 10 seats per district. So you vote for a party, and then it's an open list. So you can also, because then each party will have a list of 10 candidates, and then you can indicate which of the candidate for your party that you prefer. It's sort of the open list. And you just have to understand that, if your party gets 10% of the votes, you get 10% of the seats. And you also know that the candidate within your party that has the most votes will get elected if there's one seat, for instance. So I would go for Finland.
Are there any other questions from the room on proportional representation? I'd like to thank André. Sorry, yes? Do you want to take the mic so we can hear you, please?
I'll just yell.
Okay, good. That's okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Faulkner, Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre. My question is, so proportional. Who decides these lists, and what is the level of control of the parliamentarian versus the apparatus of the political parties? And what is the effect on the independence of members of parliament?
That's a very important question. And answer, it varies all over the place. So there are places, parties, where it's really the party apparatus that's the big say about it. In other places, it's the party members who decide first who will be the first, then the second, and so on. So it can be a complete internal democracy, how it works. But what's interesting in that case also is that you decide not only who are the 10 candidates, but also the rank order of them. Because you know that if you are top, or like the top 2 candidates, you're almost certain to be in. And if you are the 8th or 9th or 10th candidate, you're sure not to be elected. Okay, so that's a big decision about the rank order. And theoretically, that can be decided by the members as well. In an open list system, what happens is that the candidate with the most votes gets elected. So if the party has 2 seats, then it's the top candidates with 2 most votes who get elected. And in that case, with an open list, this means that you've got a contest between the parties, but also within each party, you have competition between the candidates who are basically running against each other at the same time. So that's an interesting source of tension here, because you have competition within the party as well. So that's this means that voters have a say about which candidates will be elected. So that's a plus. But the minus, it creates tensions within the parties, because candidates of the same party are contesting among each other. Okay.
Bonjour, mon nom est Teresa Trollope, je travaille pour le Musée de l'Histoire. J'ai vu que c'est écrit que le nombre de femmes élues augmente avec un système proportionnel. Est-ce que c'est vrai?
Oui.
Merci.
Oui, mais et là, il y a une littérature beaucoup compliquée. La question importante ensuite, c'est est-ce qu'il augmente plus lorsque liste ouverte ou liste fermée? Et là, je ne suis pas certain, parce que là, il faudrait que je vois toutes les études. Il y a des études qui ne sont pas tout à fait claires là-dessus, parce que l'autre question, c'est est-ce que les femmes réussissent mieux avec une liste fermée ou avec une liste ouverte? Mais c'est possible d'avoir une représentation égale des hommes et des femmes avec des quotas dans le système actuel. Donc, je crois que si on veut conserver le système actuel et qu'on veut avoir une représentation égale des femmes, il faut des quotas, alors que dans une proportionnelle, en fait, c'est tout simplement, avec la liste, on ferait un homme, une femme, etc. Et en général, ça donne les résultats escomptés.
A proportional system inevitably involves some form of list, and the list is either closed, which means that it may have some advantages, but it suffers from the disadvantage of not being democratic. Some form of party group makes the decision about who will be on that list. Alternatively, you have an open list, which means there's some form of primary or nomination process in which people are elected to their spots on the list. By definition, that election cannot be proportional. It must be based on either some kind of first past the post or block vote or preferential system. So the question I have is, when you set up a list system, are you not simply moving the fundamental problem that exists with non-proportionality to the party apparatus, to the creation of the list itself?
First, I think you're absolutely right that when there's open list, there is PR for the parties, and then they will first past the post for the candidates within each party. So there is a combination of the two elements. So that's absolutely right. At the same time, I guess, when you say it's left to the apparatus, I guess my understanding is that in most parties now in Europe, it's the members who decide who are the candidates. So there can be sort of internal democracy within the party that establishes that list. And if it's really open list, then it really means that it's the voters at the end that decide who the elected will be. So I think there is, in my view, internal democracy possible there. The only drawback is that it creates, as I mentioned, tensions within the party, because candidates of the same party are running against each other. So that's a potential drawback in terms of party unity.
Bonjour, Marilyn Gill, députée de Manicouagan, donc grande circonscription au Québec de 250 000 km². Ma question s'inscrivait en fait dans les derniers commentaires relativement, par contre, au territoire. Sachant justement, lorsqu'on parle de liste, que la vie partisane, les vies de parti, la vie militante se déroule plutôt en milieu urbain. Quels seraient, s'il y a une littérature scientifique qui s'y penche, quels seraient les impacts sur les régions, dirais-je, éloignées? Donc, non pas une région comme Laval ou Longueuil, mais une région vraiment, je dirais plus que périphérique, là, mais aux limites même du territoire. Merci.
C'est une question importante et très intéressante. Malheureusement, je ne connais pas d'études qui portent directement sur cette question-là. Et qui pourrait me permettre de voir qu'est-ce qui se produit dans un scrutin proportionnel. Ce qu'il faut s'imaginer, cependant, c'est que supposons qu'on passerait à une proportionnelle avec, disons, 5 élus dans la circonscription, c'est que la circonscription serait 5 fois plus grande, ce qui peut apparaître un énorme problème, mais n'oubliez pas qu'il y aurait 5 élus dans cette circonscription-là, et que ces élus-là proviendraient de différentes régions à l'intérieur de la circonscription. Et là, il y a une compétition entre les élus qui peuvent chacun essayer de montrer qu'ils sont un meilleur représentant local que les autres. Donc, là, je dirais qu'il y a des désavantages. Ça fait une énorme circonscription, mais il ne faut pas, je crois, surestimer les désavantages, parce que ça veut dire quand même qu'il existe compétition entre élus pour mieux servir les représentants. Donc, si j'ai besoin d'un passeport rapidement, si j'ai des problèmes d'immigration, c'est le genre de problème que les députés ont quotidiennement. Et bon, mais j'ai maintenant une plus grande district, je ne suis pas trop sûr peut-être avec qui aller voir, mais là, si je suis mon parti, il y a un député, mais c'est lui que je vais aller voir peut-être plus, ou elle, que j'irai voir. Et donc, je crois que les conséquences sont peut-être pas celles qu'on prévoit, mais je m'empresse de revenir sur le point que je ne connais pas d'études qui ont étudié cette question-là de façon spécifique.
Oui, allez.
I'm Olivia Dory, and I have a question about how to make the best use of the members' time. I assume that I am in the company of lots and lots of fellow dorks. So I read the Samara book, Tragedy in the Commons, and it came across very clear to me that the vast majority of members of Parliament don't actually find that the job that they have here on the Hill is as meaningful as the one that they thought they were being elected into. So do you have any reflections on which systems make the best use of all of the members of Parliament that are elected?
Easy question. It raises a lot of questions because it's about MPs' use of their time, and I don't know of any study of that sort. It raises questions about party discipline, and whether party discipline is related to the electoral system, and I don't think it is really. I don't think there's a big difference across different systems in terms of party discipline. But possibly, under a PR system, you would not have a party controlling everything. It would be coalition or minority. And this means that I would think that the parliamentary commissions would have a bigger role in sort of discussing, debating, and trying to get some compromise on most of these issues. And I would assume that MPs would possibly find it more gratifying. But, I think of one study that I was trying to compare, and I was trying to remember the finding of that study. I'm not quite sure. I guess the honest answer is really I don't know. It's a difficult question, and it's very interesting. Certainly the roles of MPs would be different. You have the bigger districts and competition with other MPs, or you would have the German system in which some members are elected in a district with only one seat, and other members are elected on the list. And you have two types of MPs, so that makes things a bit more complicated. But when you talk to people from different countries, they don't find it complicated at all. They understand it, they've been socialized into it, and so on. I think we overestimate. There will be a transition period if they were to move. But I think we'll get used to it, and if we change electoral systems 100 years from now, people will find it very odd that we had that old system and so on. So I think we adapt and we adjust to any kind of new system.
But wouldn't MPs be more in electoral mode all the time? If we would be in situations of minorities or coalitions that may not be as steady or as long-lasting?
My understanding is that MPs are in election mode all the time. That's my sort of understanding of things. And what you have to see that once you know that the typical thing would be minority or coalition, the government duration is the same. Governments don't last any longer in first past the post compared to PR. Because when you are in a country where you used to have coalitions, it takes time to build a coalition. You have to debate, discuss for weeks or sometimes months on an agreement. And then that agreement is basically what you'll achieve under your mandate. And so overall, governments in PR are relatively stable because you get used to it. You know that it will be minority, you know that it will be coalition, and you make deals and compromises, which sometimes you like, sometimes you dislike. But, that's part of life.
Hi there. My name's Ted Craig. I'm with Fair Vote Canada. I was wondering if you could speak briefly to the experience of New Zealand, which, although it's a much smaller country, perhaps is a good example for Canada, as we're talking about a former British colony and a very similar culture and multiculturalism, etc. And they kind of fell into their system of mixed member proportional, which they have now. It kind of started a bit of debates, and it snowballed into bills, and then a referendum, and then the legislation. And they also, this was all enacted in the mid-1990s, and then they also had a referendum in 2011 after it had been in place for a few election cycles to see if the people liked it, they'd experienced it, and did they want to keep it, did they want to go back to first past the post, which they had. I was actually in New Zealand in 2011 just traveling, and I got to witness their election, just coincidentally. And it's fascinating to see, because yes, you have smaller parties, but you still had your major parties, the two, maybe three major parties, and everybody knows they're going to form government. It's a question of who their partners are going to be, and they come to it. But anyway, my big focus is how they got to changing the system from first past the post to actually getting it enacted, if you could speak to that a bit. Thanks.
Okay. I think there's sort of good news and bad news about the experience of New Zealand. The good news is exactly what you've mentioned. They had a referendum 10 years later and decided whether they want to keep the new system, the new sort of kind of PR MMP system, and they said yes. So, the majority of citizens thought this was a good system. So that's their overall evaluation. So that's the good news. The bad news is about turnout. So there was this hope that it would increase turnout, and New Zealand is a very good, interesting case. So turnout was about 85% before 1996 when you adopted PR. It sort of went to 88% the first election, and then went down to about 75-80% because turnout is declining everywhere. So that's another example, I guess, that PR doesn't increase turnout in my judgment. But the overall judgment has been positive. They've had coalition minority governments. There are all kinds of governments which remain stable. Right after the election, there is some turmoil about exactly how the coalition will be formed and so on. So it's a bit messy initially, but then they have a government, and the government is durable. And all in all, people are relatively satisfied.
Okay, our very last question.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. My name's Laura McPherson. I'm wondering, Canada is known for being a decentralized federation, and many of the ways in which you've described moving away from a single-member plurality system would decrease the capacity of the federal government to act relative to the capacity of provincial governments, which would maintain the single-member plurality. Electoral system, perhaps in the foreseeable future, though of course they could be inspired. I'm wondering if you know of any countries in which there's been that contrast between the federal level, national level, and the provincial level, and what the consequences have been.
So you're thinking about a system where it would be PR at the national level and non-PR at the provincial level, the equivalent, is it?
Since the current proposal would have that change at the national level, but of course at the provincial level it would be decided provincially. We could expect a period where there'd be a contrast between the two electoral systems. We already have what is a decentralized system relative to what other experiences of federalism are across the world. And I'm wondering whether there would be an additional change, given that we're already decentralized, in terms of the capacity of what the consequences would be, given that it would change how the federal government would be acting.
Okay,
it would have,
so are there other examples, and what would be the impact?
The other example is the other way around. It's Australia. Australia have preferential voting system at the federal level, and they have some kind of PR at the provincial level. So that's the opposite. So, but I cannot think at this time of any example where you have exactly what would be the case here. What would be the consequences? I think would be very interesting. So, in the past, provinces have adopted new systems, and then the federal have learned from them. But perhaps it could be the other way around. But I guess the assumption here is that a PR government would be weaker. Is that sort of I've heard this argument. I'm not convinced. Clearly, under PR, there are coalitions, and there have to be deals. And that may give the impression of being weaker. You have to make compromises, and perhaps it's more difficult to have a very sort of strong position. At the same time, however, you sort of discuss this at the very early, when you discuss which coalition we form and what kind of agreement you make. Once that decision has been made, you just go on and you can adopt it. So whether PR governments are weaker is not obvious to me at all. It's not, it doesn't mean that everything is nice under PR. On the contrary, there are all kinds of deals and so on. You make deals with your enemies all the time. But I guess I'm not convinced that governments are necessarily weaker under proportional representation or coalition governments, I guess.
Thank you, André. We have had this morning, ladies and gentlemen, a master class in political science, in electoral reform by Dr. André Blais, who has really shepherded us through the question of proportional representation, what it is, what it means, what its impact has been in other countries. And I think that before we engage in any kind of electoral reform and open that Pandora's box that, as we see, has an impact not only on the way we vote, but the way we govern and the way we are represented, people like André Blais should be called to be heard. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, André. I'd like to again thank the Shirk for being our partner in this Big Thinking lecture series and really bringing home why it is that research in the social sciences and humanities is so important. not only for our academic institutions, but for the very lifeblood of our democracy here in Ottawa. I'd also like to thank Greg Fergus, notre député parrain, comme on l'appelle, de la série de causeries Voir Grand. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fergus. Thanks to all of you for joining in today's conversation. A video of this presentation will be available on our website if there are questions that you want to go over and think about as well. And I want to leave you on this note that this is perhaps the first political scientist that we've heard this season on Voir Grand, but we have another political scientist for you on April 19th. The event will feature Janice Stein, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, who will be talking about an equally timely topic, the evolving Middle East, implications for Canadian strategy. So if you thought electoral reform was complicated, get ready for Janice Stein on April 19th. And we hope to see you all there. Beyond Big Thinking on the Hill, the Federation brings big thinking to our annual Congress of the Humanities of Social Science, Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences. This year, it's our 85th year, we're moving to Calgary, to the University of Calgary for that conference at the end of May. You can find out more about the Congress by picking up a brochure on your way out. And thinking about that is very much our seminal event of the year. Merci encore à vous tous. Merci à Monsieur Blais. Bonne journée et bonne semaine. Belle journée à Ottawa comme d'habitude. Et on attend, j'imagine, avec beaucoup d'intérêt la sortie du budget cet après-midi. Merci à tous. Au revoir.
Pas